We're going to round off this week looking at Hindu gods, the continuation of Tantra and Bhakti, and classical Tamil as well as Kerala sources. As noted in the reading, one of the great achievements of Tamil culture in the field of literature over the course of the past several centuries is a corpus of over 2,300 poems collected in the 8th so-called Sangam or Chankam anthologies. According to local understandings of history, which are somewhat admittedly legendary, the authors of these poems were members of a literary academy or sangam that flourished in the city of Madurai under the patronage of the Pandya kings. The legend or the history, local history, of the Madurai Tamil Sangam may or may not be based upon historical fact. But no one who knows these poems can doubt that their authors shared a poetic grammar and vocabulary that was relatively similar. The poems presuppose their audience's familiarity with a shared repertoire of dramatic situations, also a shared understanding of geography, shared understanding of characters, as well as shared understandings of poetic figures. These are all defined through local Tamil understandings of the world and the universe, based upon the principles and grammar of poetics as recorded by the Tolkappiyam. The earliest poems in this corpus were probably composed during the first few centuries of the Common Era. The pre-modern or ancient Tamil sitar Agasthyar is traditionally believed to have been the chair of the first Tamil Sangam or Chankam in Madurai, and is thus a very important saint figure pictured here in this tradition. Now, according to the Tolkappiyam and other local Tamil religious texts, the Deva who preside over the mountains, forest, seashore, river tracts, and arid land are respectively known as Chion, Mayon, Ventan, and Minakashi. So here we have the first one, Cheon or Seon, the red one. The second one, Mayon, the dark one. Varunan, the god of sea and wind. Ventan, the king. Or Koravai, the goddess of war. Sion or Chian is an alternative name for Murugan, the beautiful one, a very popular deity in Tamil Nadu and the Tamil diaspora, who, in the course of time, coalesces with the Sanskritic god Skanda, the son of Shiva, through the iconography and mythology of Murugan, maintains some elements of Shaivism, but also maintains features not generally associated with Sanskritic images of Skanda. Mayan, also known as Mal or Tirumal, the Great One, the Dark One, became gradually identified with Vishnu. Now, of course, Vishnu is sometimes portrayed as blue, but in this particular portrayal, we don't necessarily associate Vishnu with blueness, it's darkness. Finally, Ventan, the king, tends to refer to, in the Sanskrit versions, Indra, but you have local versions that still refer to Ventan. Another local god, Kanagiaman, is a legendary Tamil woman who is pictured here from a shrine, who is the central character of South Indian epic Silapantikaram, which is written from the 1st through the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era. The story relates to how Kanagai took revenge on the early Pandyan king of Madurai for a mistaken death penalty imposed on her husband, Kovala. She therefore curses the city with disaster. So, to prevent disaster, naturally you give offerings to Kanakayama. This is relatively common with Aman characters. There's another associated with smallpox, for example, Sri Mariamman, and you give offerings to Sri Mariamman to prevent the arrival of smallpox. The Tirumuru Karupatai is unique among compositions included in the Sankam poetic corpus, and is also somewhat of a canonical text in Tamil Shaiva schools. No poems from the Sankam corpus are included in the equivalent sort of set of texts that become somewhat canonical in a sense in the Tamil Vaishnava schools. In Tamil Shaiva tradition, the match between the categories of saint and sacred scripture almost overlaps, but not so precisely. Tamil Shaivism recognizes the three saints, or Nayanamar, that we have previously discussed, whose legendary life and stories are told in the 12th century hagiography, the Periya Puranam. By now you understand there are important saints, including the Nayamara, the 63 Shaiva saints, who form this sort of poetic Tamil tradition. However, there are also poet saints such as Manikava Chakar, who, though by accident are not included in the 63, are still incredibly important. Then you also have the Vaishnava Bhakti poets. So, for example, Periyalvar, the 9th century, a poet who adopted a maternal voice in his poems of devotion to the baby Krishna, who represents the first Pillai Tamil poem that fully sort of articulates a type of structure that's going to be very prominent. But really, the most important poem that begins to articulate the structure, the Paruvam structure, is the Tiruchentor Pillai Tamil, which is composed by Pakilikutar, late 14th to early 15th century poet in praise of the god Murugan, especially in his association with the seaside town of Tiruchentar. Now, Paula Richman, who is a very prominent scholar of Tamil Hinduism and South Asian traditions, also a former professor of mine before her retirement, has summarized the legend that accounts for the composition of this poem. According to tradition, Pakal Igutar, originally a Vaishnava devotee, suffered terrible stomach pains for a substantial time. One day, an ancestor who had been a devotee of Murugan, the son of Shiva, appeared to him in a dream and asked him to sing a Pillai Tamil. The poet then saw a sacred ash and leaf had been bestowed upon him. The sort of collection of sacred ash and leaf could be readily recognized as ritual objects. He awoke to find a palm leaf beside him, a palm leaf being a dried section of the upper portion of the palm, which would form a leaf of a palm leaf manuscript, a page that could be inscribed on both sides. So he takes this leaf and begins to compose poetry on it. It's really more of a hard section, kind of like a small piece of wood, sort of like bamboo in its hardness. Now, after devotive prayer to Lord Murugan cures his illness, he composes his first Pillai Tamil to the deity as manifested in the Tiruchentar shrine. Kumara Guru Para is another important figure that we see in this tradition, and I just want to highlight him very briefly because you see Kumara Kuruparar as a 17th century figure who was a poet and Shaiva ascetic connected with the Dharmapuram Adinam. So we see a continuation of this up through the 17th century into the early modern era, very solidly. The bow song tradition found in the far southern regions of Tamil Nadu is a very important aspect of local performance that we should focus on just a little bit. Like two performance genres associated with the festivals celebrated at Draupadi temples in northeastern portions of the state, annual village temple festivals in southern portions of Tamil Nadu provide the occasion for bow song performances. In the background here, you see some Draupadi temples. Now, Stuart Blackburn, following local terminology, has designated two important categories of structure and repertoire for these bow songs. You have bow songs that are basically performed as birth stories and those that are death stories. So the birth stories narrate the history of devas and devis grouped under the term Devya Piravi. So that's the divine birth. Then you also have Deva Vancham, which is essentially the divine descent, death stories that tell the histories of spirits who are killed. So this would be Irantu Patavatai. So that would be spirits who are killed. And then you also have Vetupatavatai, spirits that are cut up. The death stories are very prominent aspects of local histories about people who lived and died and then become deified, whereas the birth stories, on the other hand, are these sort of mythic histories of devas and devis and shrine origins. Now, just to give you a little bit of background here, Draupadi Amman is a goddess from the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, named Draupadi, who's a sort of significant figure, but one we haven't touched upon yet, because it's in a different section of the Mahabharata than those sections we focused on. Along with Kutandavar, this is a primary deity of the Vaniyar Jati. So the Vaniyar are a specific Jati, which is really probably best translated as birth group or clan group, but makes up part of the notion of caste. You'll find that commonly glossed as class or caste, but I'm going to use the term jati as clan group here. So the Vaniyar are devoted to specifically Draupadi. So we find this in southern South Asia, especially in Tamil Nadu, but also in other parts of South Asia, where specific jati, and we'll talk about jati more, specific clan groups are devoted to specific gods. Pictured here in the bottom left, you see some Vaniyars celebrating Pongal from 1909. This specific jati is actually found in the northern part of the state, but you still find some overlap in the southern part of the state as well. Now we're going to kick it over here to the West Coast. If you think about this in terms of poetic saints and so forth, the traditions of Tamil Nadu are like the East Coast, East Side, and then Kerala is like the West Coast, West Side. This begins with a local adaptation of Kautilya's Arthashastra. This is essentially a Shastra text dating all the way back to the Gupta and Maurya period, which focuses on the science of many things, especially wealth is emphasized quite a lot, but also conquest. So that notion of just war, Dhammayut, is very prominent in the development of this unique literary tradition. The second genre of texts that becomes quite prominent is the Patu. Patu is actually a local word from Tamil and Telugu and Malayalam languages that really means silk. But it becomes a sort of a genre of texts here. So this genre of texts includes the Tirunelamala, the garland of the sacred shade, the 13th century text, although the advent of Kerala's literary history is really dominated by this 14th century adaptation of the Ramacharitam, which is a version of the Ramayana, if you remember correctly. Now there's also this tradition of the Manipravalam, which is essentially a new sort of language of texts, blending Sanskrit and Tamil traditions, but localizing into what becomes a Malayalam language. And this includes very important texts such as the Lila Tilakam, as well as the Ananta Puravananam. So these texts are illustrative of this tradition. Now, this being said, you will see rivalries imported from Tamil Bhakti traditions between Vaishnava and also Shaiva schools. But these are not like violent rivalries. They're more like poetic battles, if you will. Now, three very important figures in the Kerala traditions are the Niranam poets, Madhava, Sankara, and Rama. The Niranam poets, also known as the Kanasan poets, were three poets from the same family or clan by the names of Madhava Panikar, Sankara Panikar, and Rama Panikar. They hail from Niranam, a small village or settlement in southern Kerala, India, near the town and larger city of Tiruvalla. Their works are mainly comprised in translation and adaptations or adoptions of Sanskrit epics and Puranic works, which were for devotional purposes, and they lived between 1350 or so and 1450 or so. It is traditionally believed that they all belong to the same Kanasa family, and that Madhava Panikar and Sankara Panikar were the uncles of the next generation, the nephew Rama Panikar, the youngest of the three, of course. As Kanasa, they were probably akin to members of the Kaniyar Jati. So this is a Jati or specific clan or birth group which makes their claim to mastery of Sanskrit a significant feature, as Kaniyar, being adept in astrology and the study of the Ayurveda, were accepted by then as very important to local kings. Their works have been most notably assigned to the Patu taxon, so they're composing in that silk tradition of Patu poetry. It is also a sample of the revival of Bhakti schools in Kerala literatures, and they reassert the seriousness of poetic vocations in the place of excessive sensuality and eroticism of the Manipravalam poets. So they're sort of setting up a rivalry between the Patu poets and the Manipravalam poets. You have a divergence from the Manipravalam school through non-usage of Dravidian meter and also Sanskrit grammatical forms. But these Dravidian meters and Sanskrit grammatical forms are still prominent in many cases. So you'll note that I didn't cover all of the reading on local Hindu traditions in Kerala. But after you comb through those last sections, after reading through the material and performance in Kerala, how would you compare this material to other areas of the course that we have discussed so far? How about the material covering Tamil language specifically? Then also, after reading through that material on popular religiosity in Kerala, how would you compare this material to other topics in the course we have discussed? And how about the material covering Tamil language productions specifically? Then last, what is the role of humor in critique? How do you see this as playing out in the case of Kerala's regionally specific traditions, and why? Go ahead and make a quick post, and that'll be all for this week, except for a little observing performance, of course. So here we should get 3 threads of discussion. And if you want to refer to specific lines in the reading, please do leave a page number for your classmates to note.